Yeah, I'll give a good, like, little intro.
Yeah. So just in case people are watch this conversation later or they don't know about this book group, Olga and I started this at the Germantown Library. Germantown is a very small rural town, and we are friends. We love reading, and we felt that there was a lack of offerings, um, opportunities to share books that we like, and also we decided to follow the calendar for Heritage Month. Um, so it gives us an opportunity to highlight voices and authors that are normally not, I don't know, on the shelves on the library, at least around here. Um, and yeah, and we also love sharing what we're reading, right? I think that's also a big part of the book group. I'm a writer also and scholar, and I never been in a book group before, and I love sharing the experience of reading this book. It's like it's so rich when you hear someone else's um, experience of the same book. So that's how we started, and in September last year, we had the first author visiting. It was Silvina Lopez Medin. So she's a poet from Argentina who lives in the Hudson Valley. And it was so wonderful to have her. So this is our second author visiting today our club, Aailyah Bilal. We're so excited to have her. We feel so grateful. And she's going to be introduced by Rachel. So briefly, also Rachel is our neighbor friend here in Germantown. She's a professor. She teaches fiction, memoir, and social justice at Bard College. She's also a faculty member at the Center for Writing and Ethics at Bard. She has an MFA in fiction from Columbia. She has been a reader for the New Yorker, and has published in different magazines and journals. Um, so, welcome everybody. I'm going to pass the mic to Rachel, and we will ask more questions and more comments.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for that introduction. And now it is my great pleasure to welcome Alia Bilal, a fiction and nonfiction writer focusing on the Black American Muslim experience and stories that connect Chinese and Afro-diasporic peoples. A graduate of Oberlin College and the University of London School of Oriental and African Studies, her work has been published in the Michigan Quarterly Review and the Rumpus. She is the author of Temple Folk, which we're discussing tonight, a 2023 National Book Award finalist, a 2024 Whiting Award winner, and a collection Edward P. Jones hails as more than a special literary accomplishment. It is a gift of glorious songs. Temple Folk was longlisted for the Penn Robert W. Bingham Prize for debut short story collection, shortlisted for the Aspen Words Literary Prize, and received the 17th Annual Ernest J. Gaines Award for Literary Excellence. It's so obvious to me why Bilal's work keeps garnering the attention it deserves. Temple Folk is a book that announces itself on the first page, promising a reader its author is full of control, truth seeking, and wisdom, and it never stops delivering on this promise. Bilal grew up in a working class Sunni family just outside Washington, D.C., in a community which grew out of the Nation of Islam. Temple Folk explores the Nation of Islam in its second iteration, from the emergence of Malcolm to the death of Elijah Muhammad, and the Sunni Muslim communities that followed. It is a book that, as Emily Rabbitow writes, shines a light on a Black American community that, for all its influence, hasn't been given its due in fiction. Each story in this collection is emotionally complex and lovingly rendered. A debut both vivid and unforgettable, its characters sit in a reader's heart like family, both loved and questioned, simultaneously understood and nebulous. It asks us to consider what it means to leave home, to return home, and how to find our place within the world and within ourselves. So for the sake of streamlining this conversation, we've chosen 3 stories to discuss tonight. Candy for Hanif, Who's Down, and Due North. Although I'm hoping there will be time at the end for readers to ask questions about other stories as well if they wish. I'll be asking just a few craft questions about each piece, and then book club members will be invited to ask direct questions. But before we begin, I'd love to talk for just a minute about the unique way in which this book was acquired. I know you've had this conversation many times, Aailyah. It's just such a jazzy story. There's been a lot of buzz in the publishing world about how an unagented writer was offered a publishing deal seemingly, quote unquote, overnight. It's an unheard of story of recognition and success, and one that elicits the envy of so many burgeoning writers. But the truth is, you'd been diligently working on Temple Folk and your craft for a decade at least before Yadon Israel at Simon & Schuster read your manuscript. So if you wouldn't mind, I'd love for you to talk about what it was like to receive that initial email from Yadon, but also about the years of dedicated work that went into your writing before you even considered publishing Temple Folk.
Sure, I'm happy to share. So I started teaching myself how to write after graduate school. I was in London and I had just submitted my dissertation for my master's degree. And I was overwhelmed with this feeling that I'd made a mistake. Like this was not what I was supposed to be doing with my life, studying international politics. And I submitted my dissertation, and I remember walking across the Thames headed home. I was living in Vauxhall at the time. And as I was midway on the Thames, a short story came to me, a whole story. And so I ran home and I wrote down that story, and it was a terrible story. But there was enough on the page that made me say, okay, I'm going to completely reorient my life. And because I'd spent all of my money, studying international politics, I didn't think that I really had the option to study fiction in school. So I had to teach myself. And so, as you said, Rachel, for about a decade, I just, from the rudiments, taught myself, well, how do stories work? And I went through a terrible life circumstance in 2019, and starting in 2019, really ending in 2020, 2021. And in the midst of this intense suffering, I just started writing. And it was the only part of my life that felt good and rich, and it gave me an escape from my troubles. So one day my sister sends me a little screenshot of this, caption on Twitter asking for submissions from this new editor at Simon & Schuster. And I still have the text message conversation with my sister. She said, hey, you need to submit to this. And I said, do you know this person? She said, no, I don't know him, but he's asking for submissions. Go ahead and send him something. And so about an hour putting together some of the stuff I was working on in the midst of this trouble I was having, and sent it off. I just sent it off, knew I was never going to hear back. A week later, I'm sitting in bed, feeling really down. All of this stuff is weighing on me. And this person starts following me online on my Instagram account. And I was like, my Instagram is so boring. Why is this person following me? And then 5 minutes later, I decided to look in my email, and there was a message from him saying all of these nice things about my work and telling me that he wanted to be I didn't even read the title of the email, because the title was the last thing I read, and the title said, I want to be your editor. And so I was so flabbergasted by this sudden shift in energy in my life, because have you ever been in the storm You know that feeling of it, it's all consuming. It never feels like it's going to end. And typically, if we survive a storm, you know, it's like a gradual tapering off and not a sudden pivot. This was a sudden pivot because in an instant, I was above the clouds again. So that was the beginning. And yeah, that's how Simple Folk essentially got acquired.
It's such a beautiful story, and I love that mission from Yadon to bypass the gatekeepers of publishing. It was a radical move he made to make an Instagram live where he asked for work from anybody, and the result of which is Temple Folk. You said you were studying craft and teaching yourself how to write. What did that look like for you? Was that reading books on writing, or was that going through stories line by line and wondering, how is this line working? How is this hitting me? What was that process for you?
Most of it, I didn't really know how to start except to just read. And what I did was I tried paying attention to patterns in the writings of authors whose work I was really drawn to. And a couple of the books that I read, just starting to teach myself, there were three major books. The first was The Bluest Eye, which I read dozens of times. The second was Maud Martha, which I read, I think, 30 times. And then the third book was Edgar P. Jones' Lost in the City, which I read, I think, 60 times. And the more I read the books, the more I started to see, oh, there's like a structure here. And I started learning how to identify structure. That whole process of learning how to not be dazzled by stories, but to see how they're made took me 3 years, just teaching myself how to read like a writer. And then I started teaching myself how to write. And that was the longer, harder process, just because it's like muscle memory. It's like becoming a bodybuilder, but it takes so much longer. It took me at least so much longer than it would take somebody to develop a beautiful physique, you know?
I love that analogy. But yeah, that's so fascinating to study writing, to read it as a writer, and then to translate that into becoming the writer yourself. I always notice there's that huge gap when I'm teaching, and I've noticed it within myself as well, between taste level and what you like and are attracted to, and then your ability, right? And it's kind of just about closing that gap and getting closer to becoming the writers that you admire so much, or you know, that's the goal. But we start off so far from that goalpost. I love that idea of analyzing the stories for structure. I can really see that in Temple Folk as well. Edward P. Jones is an obvious influence. What other writers influence this collection and your writing in general?
You know, someone that nobody points out, who to me is just like a glaring influence in this book, is Flannery O'Connor. I know
I
that
knew it. I knew it. That first story is so Flannery O'Connor.
it really is. And that's specifically the story that I was reading a lot of Flannery O'Connor when I was writing that specific story. The story that I read over and over and over again while I was in the midst of writing Blue was, gosh, I'm blanking on the name. I think
Was it
it's
The Lame Shall Enter First or Last?
it's I think no, not that one. It's a story called something about the front lawn. It's a story about an older white gentleman and his granddaughter, and they have this orneriness in common. And the granddaughter is as belligerent in some ways as the grandfather, and this ultimately sets them on a course for conflict. And that story is really, in many ways, quite parallel to the action in Blue. And I conceptualize Blue before I found this story. So it was interesting. I was drawn to that story. Okay, I need this woman and I need her mirror in this girl. And that's what I saw in that Flannery O'Connor story. The granddaughter was mirror to the grandfather. And so it was it's a confrontation with self. And in many ways, Sister Memphis is confronting herself in through the course of Blue. And so, yeah, it was very helpful for me to read a lot of Flannery O'Connor. Yeah, there's something in my stories, there's like this dark undercurrent.
Totally.
This is also present in a lot of her work.
Yes, when I first opened the pages of Temple Folk over a year and a half ago now, I was like, oh my gosh, Flannery O'Connor. There was that, I don't know, I'm trying to think now just off the top of my head of a good adjective. It especially the children, the way in which she writes children, and I see that in The Child in Blue, and I'm so excited to go back and read the story you just mentioned to further understand that influence. But she takes them so seriously, as you do with all of your characters, but especially children, which a lot of authors, I always feel like they miss the boat on that. They're just these full, whole spirits right from the get-go, and you don't overlook that ever. So Flannery O'Connor and Edward P. Jones. Anyone else you care to mention?
Influences. Well, I love Chekhov, and influences. It's so hard to identify a few just because everybody that's on this writing path, you have to read thousands of books. And so it's like there are just tons of influences. What I do know about myself is probably easier to talk to me about work that does not resonate with me. And I stay away from satire. I stay away from work where there's any kind of cynicism that resides at the core of it. Because I believe in my approach to writing is really grounded in this idea that the writer should confront things head on, that we should not talk about things through the prism of other things, and on the second level, that it's possible to tell an earnest, heartfelt story and it not be corny, that there isn't anything wrong with shying away from or with engaging some kind of emotional height. And so I stay away from work that has any kind of cynicism at the core of it. Any work that's rooted, I'm sorry, that's my cat. That's rooted in any kind of sarcasm or satire. It's just not for me. Not that kind of.
Yeah, beautifully said. I mean, I remember a constant conversation in grad school. Students were always worried about being too sentimental. And a professor just saying, what's wrong with being sentimental? Don't we have feelings? Don't we want to share those feelings? Reminds me of what you're speaking to.
Yeah, I just small-hearted thing that I see in a lot of contemporary fiction. I just skip over it, like it's not cool. That's the second thing. And then the third thing, I'm sorry, can I just mention this?
Of course.
I just, there's this notion that the more wordy something is, the more difficult it is, the better it is. And I repeatedly see readers who read these books that are truly poorly constructed, but because the authors, they write in this really tedious style, the reader is convinced, oh, this must be really smart. And I just don't think that we should be fooled by work that is overly difficult, overly ornate. A story is just a story. I feel like the better stories are the ones that read pretty easily.
Yeah. Well, and human psychology and emotion is so complex that sometimes or oftentimes it's best rendered in simple language, right? Yeah. Let's move on to Candy for Hanif, our first story that we'll be discussing, just so we have enough time to talk about all of our stories here. I mean, all of the stories we're going to talk about are so beautiful. Candy for Hanif, to me, it's just such a complex story about motherhood. It really shines a light on the tension between a mother giving herself over to her child while also trying to preserve her own joy, sanity, and even life. Mothers are expected to love unconditionally, but this story really poses this question, like, what happens when that love puts a mother's survival into question? So I'm curious about the craft technique used here, where you present information that is then later re-examined. So for example, this is a small example, but it speaks to this craft technique that you do throughout the book, but here in the story as well. Um, at first, a reader is really touched by Sister Nora's generosity towards the homeless man, right? She's the only one who wants to help him out. But then the man's homelessness later on is put into question, as well as Sister Nora's generous spirit, right? She's getting on that bus and leaving her son by the end of the story. So, in other words, like readers feel like they have a steady understanding of reality, but then new information is revealed as the narrative progression goes on, and it challenges a reader's assumption. So, as a result, the story becomes round, it's curious in the best possible way. It feels very unsettled to me as we get to visit characters and ideas from different angles. And I'm just so curious, when you were writing Candy for Hanif, how did you keep yourself open to the possibility of a surprise as great as Sister Nora getting on that bus? Was it something set in your mind before the pen hit the page? Was that fixed before you even started writing? Or is that something you discovered along the way?
So the ending was the North Star in the process. I always try to know the ending before I write anything down. And I knew that she was going to leave. And so I was writing to that ending from the start. Um, I can't, it's hard for me to describe how that process unfolded because it all began with an image. I just saw a woman and her disabled son. And I was like, it would be neat if she abandoned him. That was the triangle.
Hmm.
Mother, disabled son, she's gonna leave, right? That was the crude initial shape of the story. And I just let it circulate in my mind. And then this world built around them. And I was like, I think what it attracted, adding to that triangle, was this idea of like the sun representing the men in Sister Nora's life, but also the kinds of men that women in religious spaces often encounter, who do not appreciate the labor they invest in making those spaces what they are, where women are cooking and cleaning and tending to children, and men are giving lectures and taking all this credit, when women are expending so much energy and very rarely acknowledged. And so that to me, it just felt like a neat little story to encapsulate this wider phenomenon of women working hard but being neglected in general, but specifically in religious spaces. Um, and so I was like, oh, we need to set her up so it looks like she's going to get her just due.
Wow.
But then it turns out to be really awful. Like the bare minimum thing. We're gonna the bare minimum gesture of gratitude. So that was kind of how it came together in my mind.
Oh, that's so fascinating. Well, and it also makes me think about that scene where she gets kind of pushed in front of the vehicle, right? And we're worried. I mean, that's the part that it's like when she gets on that bus, there's judgment and not judgment, right? From a reader. I mean, you get to decide how you feel about it. You don't offer any neat script of how we're supposed to feel. We just get to feel how we feel as readers. But that scene of the near accident, or the near violence of that accident, really presses upon that ending, because her love feels dangerous, right? It feels like it's clouding her ability to survive, maybe. So I just love hearing that you knew where you were going right from the get-go, and all the scenes crafted around that were leading to not only that moment, but that the complication of that moment and everything it meant for her to make that decision and choice. I want to open up. I have some, I could just like speak forever about all of these stories. I don't want to hog all the time and all the questions. I'd love to open up questions from the book group, the groupies as they've been self-named, for this story for Candy for Hanif, if anybody's got one.
Yeah, I'll ask a quick question. Aailyah, it was wonderful to hear you speak about this kind of patterns in writing. And I wondered about, and I was kind of connecting Candy for Hanif with Due North as this kind of motif maybe of fleeing constraints, or a character and a woman who's the fleeing mother, and kind of leaving constraints. And I thought about a story or a fiction we read together at the library by Olga Tokarczuk. And we read Flights, and there is a story about a fleeing mother with a chronically ill child, and she also gets on the subway, and she rides the subway kind of without end. And I wondered about this kind of horizontality maybe, or this like, I don't know, this structure or pattern that I find in your work, and maybe I'm connecting also some contemporary literature too, and where that that kind of character, or that kind of sort of strategy is there too. And I wanted to hear if there's a connection, or what that pattern is, even between the stories.
Yeah, I think one of the major organizing ideas behind the collection was the idea of flight and moving on, for any number of reasons. But in part, I mean, two major reasons. Like, it's difficult to talk about the Nation of Islam in this culture in the United States, and to portray it in a flattering light for some very obvious reasons. But it seemed more plausible and like an acceptable premise of a work of American literature if we were to talk about it, but from the vantage point of people who had ventured beyond it. But in venturing beyond it, to show that they land in other places that they're also departing from. So it's just this continual process of leaving, which I think is just indicative of life in and of itself. But also just in terms of the grander story of African American religion, it's always been about moving from one idea of salvation to another idea of salvation to another idea. And so just as the structure of the book, I just liked the idea of movement. And I wanted that to kind of repeat itself in many of the stories. And so in that way, they are connected, Due North and Candy for Hanif. But Candy for Hanif really is a story that lets me ventilate some of my own personal frustrations with what it means to occupy Muslim spaces as a woman, and the ways that we are overlooked. And so just in terms of what the story serves in me, I think that's part of the energy that helped me write the story. Um, and I think, honestly, this story betrays me because I think what Sister Nora does in the end is a terrible thing to do. I don't know why a woman would ever do that. But the majority of the people that talked to me about that story said she had to leave. I think she did the right thing. And I just think, what? That's an awful thing to do.
That's what my students every year, since I've been teaching this story, they defend her. They will not back down, and they say she was not going to be an alive mom if she stayed. And so this was her only choice. That's like, they will fight me to the grave about that. That's interesting. You get that response as well.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Go.
Hi, I'm Julia. I, I see my specific question. I guess what I'm still so struck by in this story is just the immediate transformation of her the second she's out of her bubble, or the minute she's away from her child, she just makes this transformation into leaving. And it just as a mom resonated so much with me, this idea that we like endure so much and stay like this. And then the fear of what would be if you let go a little, which is what ended up like she basically ends up doing what on any level we would all fear if we started to question like the commitments we've made, and I guess I'd love to hear more about the choice to not give any indication that that's there for her until those moments, if that makes sense.
I mean, I think part of the reason I was compelled to write it that way is just this bias that I have about human life. What do they call, like, the Anthropocene? Just this idea that because we are human, we are animals that have rationale, and we assign so much meaning to the things that we do, the people in our lives, when there's this other more objective view that says maybe none of it's meaningful at all. And so that there's always a way to like detach from our commitments. Like there's this other lens onto reality that says none of it matters. None of it matters. Your children don't matter. You don't matter. Society, the structures in which we live don't matter. And so you get a woman who's so myopic in terms of like, this is my son, I'm dedicated, I'm a religious, observant woman, and then impose that view onto her that none of it matters actually. And what happens? How does she respond when it clicks for her that everything can be abandoned? Like, why do I have to?
So powerful. Oh my goodness. I'm so curious within that. I brought it up a little bit in the introduction of this story, but I have to ask because it comes up in my classroom every year about the homeless man and what he's doing in that story, and that way in which like we feel sympathetic and then we feel tricked by him and we're really uncertain of the reality, and that connection, that puzzle piece that you're making between his presence and his reality, and also Sister Nora's decision. They feel inextricably linked in some way. And maybe as you're speaking about this decision of it matters and it doesn't matter, it's really resonating for me. His place in there has something to do with that, perhaps. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
You know how I imagine, and this is just me as a reader reading this work, I see him as the abandoned son.
Oh,
And
cool.
I mean, I like that clicked for me after I'd written the story. I was like, maybe she's seeing him in 10 years after he's been abandoned, not just by her, but by the temple folk. And he becomes homeless. And
Or
so she,
not, or successful.
or this, or who knows? And so she's confronting the child that she abandoned. That clicked for me after I'd written it. Like, oh, maybe this
Yeah,
is
that's
who he
cool.
becomes. That's how it works in my mind. But I don't really like plan these things out. I'm just writing what feels like the right thing to write, and yeah, there's no real when it's happening, when it's cooking, it's just pouring out of me. And I wrote the story in a week, the whole story. So I mean like conceptualization to a finished product, split up over time. So I wrote the first 3,000 words in 2 days at the end of 2021. It was December 30th and December 31st. I wrote the first 3,000 words. And then I was writing the rest of the book and figured, I better finish this story. So April rolled around and it took me, I think, 4 days to write the final 4,000 words. And so it was a week of writing, but split up over several months. And I don't know that I was really thinking. It was just like I was just seeing what happened and writing it, whatever
Sure.
I saw.
There's that poet, my friend wrote a profile on him, Shane McCrae, and there's a quote from that profile about the poem being smarter than the poet, right? Sometimes the writing knows itself more than the creator, and we have to figure it out retroactively. It's cool to hear your process. For the sake of time, I'm going to move us on to Who's Down, and so we have a little time left to speak about Due North as well. So for Who's Down, it's such a great example for me how to write a story that's not a soapbox for the author's opinion, but a vehicle to examine complex issues. It's such a short story, but it covers so many heated topics from God to earth care to blackness to white supremacy to Israel to Palestine to animal rights to feminism to Islam. And through each character's interactions with these topics, a reader is really invited to examine their own heart and mind. I found myself asking, like, with whom do I agree, disagree? Do we find ourselves morally in line with any one character through and through? Or do we agree with multiple characters when it comes to different topics? And the dad is just obviously so interesting. He's so dynamic. He's never static or one note, and he continues to surprise a reader. He speaks with anger to the white vegetarian patron about genocide and slavery, but then he keeps a really curious tone with the black Jewish waiter. He honors the messenger's final speeches on encouraging black Muslims to be masters of the land, but he's judgmental of the waiter's commitment to Israel. He tries to lead a moral and vegetarian life, but he finds himself craving and eating meat. So, in my opinion, this is how truth works, right? No one's simple, no one's wholly heroic or wholly tragic. And I'm just curious to hear about this experience of writing Who's Down, in the sense that it seems that authorial judgments would flatten the story, right? If you were telling us how to think and feel the whole time, we would feel disrespected as intellectuals, right? But you've been so successful here in remaining hands off when it comes to providing a reader with a single and easy analysis. So, my question for this story is, how do you keep your own judgments on these topics? Certainly, you must have them, but how do you keep them from finding their way onto the page and just letting the characters speak for themselves?
When I teach fiction, to the extent that anybody really is curious to know how I encourage young writers to approach these kinds of challenges, I always keep it simple and tell them to focus on something seen. And when I, as a writer, focus on the image, the judgment really doesn't have the opportunity to surface. because I'm just trying to make it visual. And if the story kind of makes sense on multiple layers, just as like the visual texture, I know all of the other math is going to be right. And so I tend to just to think like a good shorthand for writing well is just to see it. And I just saw this encounter very vividly, and I just wrote to the image.
Wow. Okay. So, do you find yourself ever going to that place of abstraction, where there's lines that have opinions in them that you later delete, or you're just so close to how the camera's moving that you never quite get to that abstraction and opinionated voice that can often creep through in fiction?
No, just because my inner editor is doing that for me.
Yeah.
And it's sort of like hearing two singers trying to sing in harmony and there's a dissonance. You just pick it up and you're like, okay, this isn't working. And that's sort of the way that I fine tune. You do that over a number of years, and it's a process that just takes care of itself. And so the stories it just gets a little bit easier because you know how your instrument works. And the mind just doesn't revisit those error points. And so, yeah, like I think it's just fortunately what happens to somebody that's, you know, any writer that's just really worshipful in the writing space. I think that is a place you will inevitably arrive at. Is like the instrument, your body, your mind is just it's making those kind of considerations unnecessary because you did the work um, of editing out your process.
Right. This is becoming that bodybuilder as the reader and writer that you're then just strong enough to do that on the page as it's coming out.
Yeah, focusing on the image.
Beautifully said. Questions from others on.
Yeah, I can take it from there because I'm surprised you're sharing that you build the stories from the image. Um, One of the first things, the things that I noted was that the voices of the characters are so important. And I was gonna ask you if you could speak a little more about how to build a character from their voice. Um, and also this gesture of passing the mic to a community that has been silenced. Um, I enjoy so much how you show the characters and the scenes without judging them, um, just letting them speak for themselves. I noticed that there are a lot of first person narratives, and also in the stories where we have a third person narrator. Um, we see a lot of direct speech, and um, yeah, I constantly had this quote um, from Whitman that I contain multitudes, um, and it's so wonderful how you can present um, show so much from this community that I didn't know anything about. But it's not just giving voice to the community, it's just showing the complexity, the contradictions, the layers inside um, this group. Um, so yeah, I'm curious to hear more about your hearing and voices.
I started really paying attention to voices when I attempted my second story. So the first successful short story that I ever written is Woman in Niqab. I wrote that story in 2015. And then after I finished that story, I immediately started working on Janaza. And janaza was really hard because I was, for the first time ever, trying to write a man and just getting my head around the fact that I was bringing so much of myself to woman in niqab, you know, because I didn't really have to challenge myself to understand what a teenage girl, her aunt and her mother would think. You know, they're women, like I'm a woman. Nobody would second guess the authority of my perspective into their lives. But then you have a man. And it wasn't just a matter of getting a voice right. It was a matter of like, how do you shape the way they think? And that is, I think, the key to understanding voice, is to stop thinking about the words the person speaks. Because in my analysis, as I was doing this work myself, I realized like male speech patterns and women's speech patterns, there are some subtle differences, but what really makes the genders and on the page is a thought process. And so if I wanted to write like a man, I had to examine the structures of analysis that I was imposing on the voice, and that creates the voice. And that, when I figured that out, it was a lot easier to write in different voices, because I just had to understand I needed to build in some, like the architecture of the person needed to be a little subtly different. I wasn't just hearing a voice, but there had to be something else that would give them something neat, something different. I hope that was useful.
Would anybody else like to ask a question on Who's Down before we move on to Due North? We've got about 10 minutes.
Actually, I can follow up on this and move on to the next story, if you don't mind, because I'm so intrigued about the structure of the sentences, especially in Due North. And now that we're talking about voices, and that you mentioned this, that you have in the back of your mind how the structure of thinking will affect the way we speak and the way we express ourselves. I noticed in Due North, the sentences, the paragraphs are longer. There's a lot of subordinations on the phrases. And also we have this character who is learning to write in Arabic. And my question is, do you see, I kept thinking about the structure of the paragraphs and the sentences with this subordination. And I wonder if that's something that has to do with the Arabic language, and or if you see that as a symbol of something else that we can read into a little more, like is that? I noticed, for example, just to give you an example, my native language is Spanish, and I notice in a lot of Spanish literature that the phrases tend to be longer. There's a lot more subordination, right? Versus English, everything is shorter and more concise. And here, so it was unusual. That's why it caught my attention. And then I see the character learning a foreign language to her. And yeah, it's so rich that I wonder if you see something behind that.
Well, I didn't really make a specific connection of that sort. What I did was, Arabic seemed like it was important to capture that, just because when we think about this community that's abandoning the Nation of Islam and becoming Sunni, of this understand native language, and that we should.
Oh, Is that just for me or is Aailyah frozen a little?
Yeah, it's frozen.
live in that area.
Aailyah, if you can hear us, you froze about a minute ago. Hopefully you can come back to us and explain your wonderful answer. I was hearing pieces of it and so interested. It might even just be signing off and signing back in again, perhaps.
Or turning the camera off.
Okay, here we go. Hopefully she'll come back.
Oh, she's
Oh,
changed.
hi, Julia.
Thank you so much.
It's so good to see you here.
Great seeing you guys. Rachel, we miss you.
I know, miss you. Oh, there we go. Welcome back.
What just happened?
Just froze a bit. You were starting to talk about language and whether or not you made that connection. And you were saying you had not, and then you kind of froze. So you could take it from there if you remember what you were saying.
I think a deeper social um, than African are educating their children. There's a heavy emphasis on Arabic now, in a way that it didn't exist.
We missed
Are
a
we
little
frozen?
bit of that. Yeah.
Can't hear anybody.
I think maybe you want to try turning the camera off for a little bit so we can hear you better. Sometimes that makes a difference.
Okay, I'll stop the video. Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's very clear.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, I was just saying that. You know what? I'm gonna move because I want.
Take your time, Aailyah. We're here waiting, excited for your answer.
Is that any better?
Yeah, we can hear you clearly now.
Okay, hold on. I'm gonna turn on some light.
Okay.
Yeah, sometimes that makes a difference too.
Okay, how's that?
That's so far so good.
Okay, I'm really sorry.
Oh, that's okay.
My Wi-Fi situation. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry.
This is modern day living.
Yeah.
All right, so take 3. Let's try one more time for this question answer.
There was no deeper significance to the mentioning of Arabic in terms of the length of the paragraphs. I think the paragraphs are so long in that particular story because Taqwa herself is like a truly deeply spiritual woman, you know, like, and so it's like meditative, like there's this of depth that she's trying to access, and it just is a reflection of her spirituality, I think, more so than a commentary on Arabic.
I love when you talked about this complexity of writing gender or writing a human. And I wanted to ask about Jibril and kind of the story too that has such complicated beings in terms of their desires and their subjectivities. And I wanted just to hear about Jibril and how how you created him, how you sort of, created him, and how he sort of operates in this story.
Thank you for asking about him. Nobody ever asks about him. And I love his story.
Love him.
So Jibril comes directly from the Quran. And in the Islamic story of the way Prophet Muhammad receives a revelation, he goes into a cave. Prophet Muhammad goes into a cave where he's visited by the angel Jibril. And before the angel Jibril will deliver this revelation to Prophet Muhammad, he tells he tells Muhammad to read 3 times, I think it is. And each time Muhammad says, like, I can't read, I'm illiterate. And he hugs the prophet. He hugs the prophet, and that is how he imparts this revelation. And so you transpose that onto due north. Jibril is an angel who comes into his own sister's life to deliver the revelation of her true identity. And as opposed to it being some kind of dogmatic thing, like you're a prophet, it's more like, you gay, girl. You're gay. Embrace yourself. You're fine. There's nothing wrong with you. And so he's a prophet. He's an angel, rather, who's delivering the revelation of herself. And so that's sort of how I conceptualize Jibril.
I love that. And he's so prodigal too, and humane. And, you know, I love that you said that it's not like this, you know, prophetic kind of like build up for him. He's so complex, yes, in that he's absent and then he's not, and maybe that is very angelic.
Yeah, that's how I see him. I see him as just like somebody that's just really real. You know, like the best that any of us can do is say, yeah, I messed up. I made mistakes, but like I'm living with the mistakes I made, and I'm trying to be a good person despite like these errors in my past. You know, like I'm trying to live a decent life. And I just see him as like this moral example in the story. Like he's something about him is just the most solid of all of the characters in a way. Um, but everybody in the story is slipping off, has these these shortcomings, and everybody is human. But there's something about Jibril that seems like especially noble to me. Um, um, and so, yeah, I really like him. I like him.
It's such a powerful moment when he does sort of reveal to Takwa her own identity in that very common, like you said, you know, just colloquial. He's not worried about it. He's not surprised by it even. And you take such a hilarious bit. I love the humor that like she wards off the ghost of the imam with these pictures of women in bikinis, which is so hilarious. And then it turns into being so significant too. I love how you can do both of those things simultaneously. Give us that real life humor and then the heart of the matter as well. So impressive. I want to be conscientious of your time and wrap things up. If there's something else somebody would like to say before we close out the evening, I'll open it up. I know we're kind of like all desperate with many, many questions. So we could go on forever if I don't put a cap on this. But are there, you know, any few remaining things that we just must ask?
I'm hanging out. We haven't heard from Julia's phone. Julia's on the phone.
Julia, where are you?
preoccupied. She's got other things going on.
I'm figuring out how to unplug, how to unmute myself. What a gift. What a gift. Thank you. I was in my son's basketball practice, but following everything, and drove back 15 minutes listening to everything, and it's just so much needed. We should just, it's such a precious gift.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank
When
you.
I don't have the opportunity to tell people that much. I mean, the book has gotten like it's the responses to the book have been really mixed. But what I tell people is like, I don't know that people understand that this world, the world of Temple folk, is the same world that gave us hip hop music.
Mm-hmm.
Like when we think about the aesthetics of hip hop, they really derive from the stories
Mm-hmm.
that are being told in this book. And so, I think that there is great cultural relevance to a book like this, and it explains an art form that we interact with on a daily basis. Whether or not you're a fan of hip hop music, you are consuming the products of
Yes.
Muslim movement on a daily basis.
Absolutely.
Through hip hop. And so, yeah, I'm grateful that you, Julia, have found a connection to the stories. I do hope that as this book gains some age, that those connections are clearer.
Hi, I'm Adrienne, and this is my first time to this group, so I didn't know what to expect, but I'm so thrilled that the writer is here. It's really very special. And I'm just going to say you're going to have to come again, because the stories that I took the most notes on and I had most questions about were not the ones we covered this time. So come back and do the others.
Oh, you can feel free to ask now if you want. I'm happy to hang out.
Okay. Well, do you have time? Is that okay? Okay, so I've missed the beginning, and I probably should have read about you in the back of the book, but are you a Black Muslim yourself, or how did you come to this whole setting?
I was raised Muslim. I don't consider myself practicing at this point in my life, but in many ways, I'm still culturally Muslim. My family, my grandparents converted to the Nation of Islam in the 50s, and they raised my father and his many siblings in the nation. But by the time I was born, they had become Sunni already. And in my childhood, they sometimes would talk about the old reality in a pretty negative light because the family was really traumatized by their experiences in the nation. And it made me so curious, like, what was so awful about it? I think it just grew my curiosity, but that's how I'm connected to the world.
Both my father and my husband were foreign service officers. So I actually grew up in the Middle East, in about like all the countries, and one after the other. And so I have some, thoughts about Islam also. And a lot of my questions were related more to, for example, they're saying that, well, I knew already that Islam is submission and obey, and so I have some issues with that. But another thing was, and we may share these from what you're saying, but one of them was there is an emphasis, it came up in the story, one of the stories that in Islam, everyone is created equal and should be treated equally. But in fact, over and over again, women are not, and they're separated in so many ways. And so I'm just curious about that, because I've never actually spoken to someone about it,
I mean, unfortunately, I think that's an indictment on religion in general, whether we're talking about Islam or we're talking about developments in the early church or I can't think of a religious tradition that does not draw from, you know, this human tendency we have to try to subordinate the will, the desires, the hopes of women, you know, across time, across human experience, you know. I think one informs the other, and I don't, but as far as the stories are concerned, um, all people being equal, and you know, that not being born out in a religious life, I think that's part of why most of the stories are about women. I just am tired of reading about Muslims and people just self-consciously focus on men. You know, if you're going to talk about, before this book came out, if you ever wanted to talk about Black Muslim realities in America, there are three people that get talked about. Three people: Malcolm X, Muhammad Ali, and Elijah Muhammad. Those three. And so there are dozens of movies, books, all kinds of media about those guys. And I just think there were whole communities of people surrounding these men, and lots of women. What about their stories?
Thank you.
Absolutely. I'm sorry if I interrupt, but it just listening to you now just brought me back 2000 and I want to say 26 or 25. No, not 2026. What am I saying? 2006 or 2005 when one year I arrived to the US and I went to the Bronx. They had to New York, to Harlem, and they have the mosque there and a big revolution because a Christian white woman that didn't speak English at all and entered and spoke at the mosque. And the man, and I was actually, I don't know how I ended up there somehow, but what a gift to know other um, you know, was it is because the world, we are all different. So I'm not afraid of being exposed or being side by side to someone that maybe it's not I'm Brazilian originally. So but it was like such it is, and I have since then many Muslim friends, and that's where I learned, maybe it's my accent or whatever, assalamu alaikum. That's every time we saw each other, what a richness for us to be able to interact regardless of the, you know, what beliefs or but yeah, the men were in the front, and those three that you said, they were exactly the ones that, you know, all the imams were, you know, so you are right. And then the role of women, I think that's why it resonated so much, you know, the gift, you know, the gift of you, of being a writer and putting your, yeah.
Thank you. I was in Baton Rouge, Louisiana last fall, and was on a radio program, and you know, very conservative red state. They had just passed some bill putting like the 10 Commandments in all of the schools, right? Like that's the kind of place where I was visiting, and someone called into the radio program. He was really nice, and he said, "Could you please address the status of women in Islam, and you know, how people, for instance, in countries like Iran, like the status of women in places like that versus here." And I was thinking, like, women in the United States are losing bodily autonomy. This is not a Muslim issue. This is about what human beings have always done to control women. It doesn't matter what like your religious beliefs. It's just this human tendency. And so part of the great gift of literature is it helps us see our commonness despite like the superficial differences of our origins. You know, we look different, we speak different languages, we come from different places, but there are so many commonalities. And if women could only, if humanity could only see through the lens of, and the typification, the vilification of people, and see, like, we have the capacity and we often do these things ourselves, it brings down that judgment, you know, because we're as capable of the kinds of, and often guilty of the same kinds of wrongs we assign to other people. Yeah, and I do hope that this book makes it clear that, like, in portraying the complexity of Muslim lives, I hope that people can also accept their own complexity and say, you know, there are things that I say I believe, but in practice, am I really walking that walk, you know?
Well, I really value everything that you've just said, Aailyah, and the heart and mind that has created these stories. It is a collection that is so complex, critical, loving, non-judgmental. It really just has that humanity at its heart, and invites us into this world, but also, like you just said, into our own spirits. And that is, the double gift, as Julie was saying. Such a gift. I am going to thank you so much for sharing this very special evening with us. And I know people have children to put to bed. And it's just, my God, it's always a pleasure to read and discuss your work. I'm so looking forward to getting my hands on your next project as soon as it hits the stands. I haven't stopped thinking about it ever since I knew something was in the works. So really, really looking forward to that. And just thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Rachel. I'm always down. Whatever you invite me to, just know you have an automatic yes.
Ah, yay. Careful what you say. You're going to be invited to everything now.
It's okay. And thank you to the Germantown Library.
Yeah,
Thank
you so much.
And thank you, Rachel, also for making the connection.
Absolutely. All right. Good night. Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Good night.